Right, I'm going to comment now on this movie RFK from 2002. It's a TV movie made for TV, 95 minutes, and as the title would suggest, it's about the younger brother of the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, that brother being Robert Kennedy. And the film traces uh, what happens to Robert just before his brother is murdered in Dallas, Texas. And at that time, of course, he was the Attorney General. And the following repercussions when the Vice President, Lyndon Baines Johnson, took over the helm, and the working relationship, or not, as the case may be, that he had with Robert F. Kennedy. It starts off with, let's just have a look at the cast. This was directed by Robert Dornhelm, writing by Hank Steinberg. Linus Roach plays the lead character, Robert F. Kennedy. James Cromwell is Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Lyndon James Johnson. John F. Kennedy is played by Marlene Donovan. And then members of the Kennedy clan. Marnie McFall plays Ethel Kennedy. She's the wife of Robert. Then we have Joe Kennedy Sr., played by David Gardner, is the father. And Corinne Connolly plays Rose Kennedy, who is the mother. And Kevin Hare plays Ted Kennedy, who's a brother. And what else have we got here? Others that I'm not familiar with. So the early part of the intro, we hear Robert Kennedy uttering strong opinions on everything and anything, particular emphasis on the communist-led Cuban government and one Fidel Castro. Robert is certainly not too enamored with him, and but we get the sense that Robert is a man who won't shy away from stating what he believes, and he upsets quite a lot of people with his character because he goes right for the jugular. Very much a political icon. So what is his name? RFK, RJK, I can't remember. Anyway, Robert Kennedy. The early footage, we hear him sort of his tirade with regard to the mafia and his determination to clamp down. This is when he's Attorney General. And then after the death of his brother, he then gets really uptight about the fact that Oswald had been employed by the CIA, and the implications of all that suggest that they may have had a hand in the death of his brother, so that fuels his anger. We actually see real footage of the funeral cortege with Jackie Kennedy, which is sort of mixed in with the drama, and I thought that was quite well done. And then we move on to points of detail. Johnson basically distances himself after Bobby resigns his Attorney General position, and Johnson wants nothing to do with the possibility of a vice president nomination vis-a-vis Kennedy, and so he then decides to sidestep, and he continues his political career by getting the nomination for the senator for New York, and of course he's successful in 1964. it's quite a lot of discussion amongst his inner circle about what path he should lead, uh, and he's determined to try and be his own man rather than the younger brother of the assassinated president. And I quite like Roach, although his accent is a little bit dubious. But anyway, the film's progressing. It's in black and white. TV movie. Correct an error. The movie actually incorporates black and white real footage, plus black and white footage that is the will of the director, but it also mixes it up with colour footage. We then catch an early speech to his staff, where he basically says he wants to be challenged by his staff, no yes men. And then we go to real footage of the Wattstack riots in 1965. As a senator, Kennedy gets to grips with the enormity of the task, the poverty, the racial discrimination, the impact on children in the inner cities, in New York particularly. And the film cultivates a feeling that Kennedy is communicating with his dead brother in his dream, and we see these sort of dreamlike sequences with him having a conversation with his brother Jack. I suppose it's fairly harmless, although it did strike me as somewhat pathetic, really. But anyway, let's move on. The scene where Robert goes into the ghetto and walks amongst the neighbourhood, and we strikingly see the state of the buildings, the degradation. It's like it's a slum is actually being rather presumptuous. It's more than a slum. It's really a nightmare to live in those sort of conditions. It looks like it's just come out of a warlike footing, with buildings in a poor state of repair, in many instances half destroyed, and complete real lack of any sort of energy and business going in these communities. And it's reflected in the dialogue when it describes the impact on education living in this type of environment. And of course the brunt of this degradation is felt by the African American community. There's a great scene when Kennedy questions a local sheriff about how he reacted to protesters who were effectively a picket line when confronted by strike breakers who were being aggressive. The sheriff seemed to perceive that the protesters slash those on strike or sympathetic to strike were likely to cause a riot. The way it's delivered by Kennedy is absolutely brilliant, as he really destroys any credibility that the sheriff has in terms of his response to a situation where he's clearly in league with the employer, and has assumed that they are right and that the protesters are wrong. Very typical response, of course, to trade union activity, both in the United States and in other parts of the world, particularly with reference to the UK, which is where I'm from. The protesters, and in fact the dispute, highlights the importance of workers, illegal workers, migrants, working for a pittance, but perceived by the authorities as illegal immigrants, and therefore have no rights whatsoever with regard to the right to work. And Kennedy is very sympathetic to their cause as he talks with this man Chavez, who has a name which is very familiar with Latinos, of course, and he appears to be well received by the leader Chavez. The movie then shifts on to the thorny question of the Vietnam War. Of course, at the commencement of this war, the US attitude shown by John Kennedy, supported by his brother, was to curb the spread of communism. Now, with daily sort of protest against the war, the cost of it, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of lives, and the fact that they're losing it, leads one Dick Goodwin to resign his position in Johnson's inner circle. And Robert Kennedy is confronted with the possibility of having to U-turn to come out against the war. And he believes that Johnson will take the opposite view, but he believes that he will take the opposite view in terms of all issues. But this shift in thinking is highlighted at this stage of the movie. Kennedy's globe-trotting, which involved going to South Africa, making a speech, which was very much against the apartheid regime, and then he pitched into the hot potato that was Vietnam by meeting the French Foreign Minister in Paris, who conveyed to Kennedy, who, let's be reminded, hadn't got a position in Johnson's White House, to make comment with any sense of substance regarding the American government. The French foreign minister said to Kennedy that Hanoi was prepared to negotiate if the Americans ceased bombing of their territory. We then moved to the White House, and there's a really hot-tempered exchange between Johnson and Kennedy over his globe-trotting, and the implication by Johnson that he was stepping outside his brief. Kennedy defended his right to be able to meet and hear what others had to say, and then launched his support for the French Foreign Minister's idea, which of course was immediately ditched by Johnson, who tried to convince, with no evidence whatsoever, that the war was now going in the US favour. Johnson was, his position was that he would not take this action to cease the bombing, given the fact that they were winning the war, which was a complete falsehood, of course. So Johnson is clearly in the pocket of the chief of staff when uttering these sort of comments. So I was into my diatribe about this political war of words in the White House, with Johnson making it quite clear that he would not cease bombing of North Vietnam, based on the fact that he tried to convince Kennedy that they were winning the war, which was complete falsehood. Kennedy, in his comment about supporting the French Foreign Minister's idea of a ceasefire with regard to bombing and a negotiating table, had clearly done a U-turn after his original position with his brother was to rid the continent of communism. So the film has touched bases on fundamental political struggles within the White House between the President of the United States and the Senator for New York City. And of course this throws out the sort of the possibility that the eventual assassination of Kennedy may well have been linked to the fact that the Johnson government needed to shut him up because he was becoming a political embarrassment for Johnson. That's all speculative, of course, but it's worth mentioning in this comment on the movie, The Life Story of Robert Kennedy. Conclusion of that terrific scene between Senator Kennedy and President Johnson. The final comments are made by Johnson, who basically spells it out. If you come out against the policy of the American president in office, then the baggage of the Kennedys will be with you. And it's delivered almost as a threat, with that looming in the back of your mind that Kennedy was assassinated. It really does stink of possible involvement in the Johnson administration, which led up to the death and assassination of Senator Kennedy by Sirhan. Quite interesting that the movie then moves on to Kennedy making a public speech about his belief that the bombing should be stopped, acknowledging his own part with his brother in starting the war in Vietnam, involving American troops. And then he then gets the consequences of this. The media rally round Johnson and have a poll, which is probably not accurate, that the American public are still in support of the war. But more interestingly, there's comment by one journalist that suggests that Kennedy was responsible for the attempted assassination of Fidel Castro in Cuba, which failed, and the consequences of that was that the communists in Cuba took matters into their hands to assassinate John F. Kennedy. So basically they're trying to paint, tar the brush of Kennedy to try and basically say that his shift in view is based all on personal ambition rather than on what's good for the American people. Of course, it's complete path of lies with regard to the Castro link and the link towards the assassination, particularly in light of the fact that that Lee Harvey Oswald, who previously worked for the CIA, was the shooter. So the plot thickens, but it's clear that Kennedy's position is now under threat by the administration, and although he's got bodyguards and protection, this is subtly being linked to his change in his political opinion with regard to Vietnam. The film then moves us into this dreamlike state where he's talking to his brother, and it's clear that he's having doubts as to whether in fact his positions did have an effect which led to the assassination of his brother. His positions, were they so potentially problematic that he indirectly precipitated what later took place in Dallas? Self-doubt, really, in his own decision-making, which is an interesting way of looking at the issue in terms of his own personal anxiety, his dreamlike state. And I like that. I like that sort of speculation, but it might be speculation, but much like the Oliver Stone movie, JFK, about the speculation as to the causation of the assassination of the President of the United States. This sort of conspiracy sort of theory is enhanced by the way this film is presenting the issue about anxiety and dream, connecting Robert to his brother's demise. The film then moves to discussions within the family, Robert and his wife Ethel, and Teddy, and even given his bad press, the fact that he's been described as a traitor, etc., etc., there's a feeling within the room that he needs to stand against Johnson for the nomination of the Democratic Party, and if he then became president, he could stop the war and start to focus on domestic problems rather than foreign policy. It's a very, and the one thing that I like about this, the timing of me watching this, is the impact of his son now in 2023 running for president. He is pledged to run for president, and how the media is trying to sort of basically not respond with any sort of sense that this is a genuine run, and they're sidestepping him, and no comment from Biden and the administration about the fact that another Kennedy is now putting his 2 feet forward into politics. I wonder how that might be impacted in terms of this underlying sort of corruptness that was around at the time that the 2 Kennedys were assassinated. And the fact is, the speculation could be, could lightning strike for a third time? Could the establishment, the CIA, the Biden administration, given the fact, the evidence of all the falsehoods and conspiracy theories and lies over COVID-19, the administration in effect has already basically tainted itself as being unreliable with regard to the truth, and so therefore it questions their morality and suggests that they may, to silence yet another Kennedy, go down another criminal road, which unfortunately makes Kennedy's announcement he's going to run as potentially life-threatening to him. And it says everything for the man that he's putting 2 feet forward and not turning and running away from this possible situation developing. Fascinating. On the airport tarmac, as he gets off a plane and heads for his car, a barrage of reporters throw questions at Kennedy, and the most specific is he going to run for the Democratic nomination? His answer, after some consideration, is that he is not going to run against Johnson. But he doesn't say he isn't going to run. He's only not going to run against Johnson, which opens the door and this is, of course, how history evolved. If Johnson were to announce that he isn't seeking the nomination and that he's just going to be a one-term president. So again, I don't know how accurate this script is, but it's certainly thought-provoking. Alongside this political shenanigan, there's the continued position of Cesar Chavez with regard to the strike mentioned earlier and Kennedy's friendship with him. We then join him, Chavez, as he's midway through a hunger strike and it is deteriorating quickly. And he asks Kennedy to make a speech on his behalf due to his weakness about the ultimate sacrifice for the benefit of others. In this context, it's talking about Chavez starving himself to make a point about the right to strike and withdraw one's labour. Alongside that, of course, is the ultimate sacrifice that is used far too often, perhaps, but with regard to war and the sacrifice of those that served the country in war and die because of that. So very interesting that the issues, the right to strike vis-a-vis the war, are sort of hurtling through Robert Kennedy's life at the same time, these two crucial issues. And I find that particularly poignant. The film moves on. It's absolutely fascinating. On a plane, surrounded by his supporters, Kennedy decides to U-turn what he previously said about not running against Johnson and declares that he's going to run. And within a very short period of time, Johnson announces on state TV that he's not going to seek the nomination for another term as the Democrat nominee. So all of a sudden, now it appears that Kennedy's got a free run, a free ride to the nomination and the likelihood of being successful as the Democratic nominee for the President of the United States. Now, of course, history tells us that he was heading full pelt towards his own demise. So how impactful is all that with regard to what was announced when he decided to run and when Johnson decided not to run? One can speculate. We then get a scene where his team are asking him to identify himself, and he basically says to avoid all the negativity about anti-this, anti-that, and be proactive in terms of poverty, in terms of discrimination, and in terms of getting out of the war. And we see him on his soapbox telling public what he's going to do. But what ran through my mind was that his words about his potential actions must have frightened to the core the establishment, the political establishment, the bureaucracy, the capitalistic corporations. They must be shaking in their boots about the possibility that this man could shake up the status quo. And the implications of that, of course, in the context of his assassination further down the road, are enormous. So many great scenes in this movie. There's an Oval Office meeting between Kennedy and Johnson, and Johnson points out a very apt comment that Kennedy asked who's Johnson going to endorse, and he sidesteps that and basically says that you, Kennedy, aren't running against Humphrey, aren't running against McCarthy, aren't really running against Nixon, who's been nominated by the Republicans. You're running against your brother's record. And then we move to him getting off a plane in Indiana in April 1968 and receiving the news that Martin Luther King has been assassinated in Memphis. Wow. We then get a little hint of the dirt that's thrown around politically, information that whilst he, being the AG, he authorised the surveillance of King through wiretapping or bugging. Asked for a comment and later acknowledged that he did, based on fear for the life of his brother. So to the final frames where we witness what? No. Kennedy's last speech, as he walks through the crowd towards his car, he's taken down by shots. And as he asks about others, as he fights for life, we then hear his speech and real footage of the masses, crowds after his assassination. All very poignant. Final thoughts then. Excellent film. Linus Roach is superb as Robert Kennedy. Also good performances by James Cromwell as LBJ Johnson. And I'd like to point out that the latter part of the film, there's two bird songs which encapsulate the upheaval and the issues that were facing America at that time with regard to freedom. And of course those songs, the latter part of the 60s, the notion of love the one you live, turn, turn, turn is one of the songs that we hear performed by the Byrds, and it's very, very, very much apt in terms of how this film is tackling these painful issues.